The Galactic Academy for Strategic Defense was the pinnacle of interstellar military training, an institution renowned for shaping the brightest minds of the galaxy into elite strategists. Its halls were filled with cadets from countless species: Hulking, reptilian Thalzar warriors, sleek, feline Xraya tacticians, and crystalline Aurelian scholars, to name a few. Each species brought its unique strengths and perspectives, making the Academy a melting pot of cultures and talents. Yet amidst this vast diversity, one species was often regarded as out-of-place: humans. Humans were viewed as fragile, primitive beings, their homeworld, Earth, categorized as a death world, a planet deemed hostile to life due to its unpredictable nature. While their resilience was acknowledged, their capacity for advanced strategic thought was met with skepticism. Many alien cadets considered humans more suited to grunt work than leadership roles, a perception that had become an unspoken norm. Cadet Lila Carter was acutely aware of this bias. From the moment she arrived at the Academy, whispers of doubt had followed her. Despite her stellar performance in tactical exercises and simulations, her accomplishments were often dismissed as flukes or attributed to luck. She had learned to tune out the mocking stares and murmurs, focusing instead on her studies and honing her skills. Still, it was impossible not to feel the weight of her peers' disdain, especially when she was unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight. The announcement came during a routine assembly in the Academy's grand auditorium. Rows upon rows of cadets sat at attention, their uniforms gleaming under the bright lights. On stage stood Admiral Theron, a towering Thalzar with scales that shimmered like molten silver. His deep voice echoed through the chamber as he addressed the gathered students. "For this year's final simulation," he began, his tone commanding respect, "we have devised a scenario unlike any you've faced before. Your objective is to defend against a superior enemy fleet, using whatever means necessary. The simulation will test not only your strategic aptitude but also your ability to adapt and lead under pressure." The cadets murmured in anticipation. The final simulation was a rite of passage, a culmination of years of rigorous training. It was not only a test of skill but also an opportunity to prove oneself before the Academy's elite instructors. Admiral Theron paused, letting the tension build, before continuing. "The leader of this mission will be Cadet Lila Carter." The room fell silent. For a moment, it seemed as though no one had heard him correctly. Then came the murmurs, the whispers of disbelief rippling through the crowd. Lila felt dozens of eyes turn toward her, some wide with shock, others narrowing with skepticism. From the corner of her eye, she saw Xraya cadet, her sleek fur bristling, lean toward Aurelian and mutter something that made the crystalline alien chuckle. Lila's heart pounded as she stood up, her face a mask of composure despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She met Admiral Theron's gaze and gave a curt nod before taking her seat again. The murmurs grew louder, transforming into barely restrained laughter. A Thalzar cadet in the row behind her leaned forward, his gravelly voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, this should be interesting," he said. "A Deathworlder leading a fleet. Let's hope she doesn't get us all adapted to death." Lila clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The ridicule was nothing new, but this time it stung more than usual. Leadership in the final simulation was an honor, a recognition of exceptional potential. Yet instead of pride, all she felt was the suffocating pressure of their expectations or lack thereof. The briefing for the simulation was held immediately after the assembly. Lila walked into the strategy room, her mind racing with possibilities. The room was dominated by a massive holographic display of the battlefield, a three-dimensional projection of the simulated star system. Around the table sat her team, an assortment of cadets from various species, each more imposing than the last. They watched her with barely concealed skepticism as she took her place at the head of the table. "Well, leader," drawled Crix, the Thalzar who had mocked her earlier, "what's the plan? Or are we just going to wing it, Deathworlder style?" The others snickered, their amusement palpable. Lila ignored them, focusing on the holographic display. The enemy fleet was massive, its ships bristling with weapons and protected by advanced shielding systems. The simulated scenario placed their fleet at a significant disadvantage, both in numbers and firepower. It was a near impossible situation, designed to test creativity and resourcefulness. Lila took a deep breath and began to analyze the data. Her mind worked quickly, identifying patterns and weaknesses in the enemy's formation. The enemy commander, a simulated AI, was known for its aggressive tactics, often leaving its flanks vulnerable during an assault. If they could exploit this weakness, there was a chance, albeit a slim one, to turn the tide. "Here's the plan," Lila said, her voice steady despite the doubt radiating from her teammates. "We'll divide our fleet into 3 groups. Group 1 will fight an attack on their front lines, drawing their forces forward. Group 2 will position themselves near the asteroid belt, using the terrain for cover. Once the enemy overcommits to the fight, Group 2 will launch a surprise attack on their flank." "And Group 3? Asked Nissa, a Xraya tactician whose tone was more curious than mocking. "Group 3 will remain hidden in the nebula," Lila replied, pointing to a dense cluster of gas clouds on the holographic map. "They'll act as a reserve force, ready to exploit any openings or reinforce weak points as needed." The room fell silent as her teammates processed the plan. It was unorthodox, relying heavily on timing and coordination. The use of the nebula as a staging area was particularly risky, as it would render their sensors almost useless. Yet there was a method to her madness, a logic that couldn't be ignored. Crick snorted. "You really think this is going to work? We should just hit them head on. Show them what real strength looks like." Lila met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "If we go head on, we'll be annihilated before we can even scratch their shields. This is our best shot." Nissa tilted her head, her feline eyes narrowing in thought. "It's risky," she said, "but it might just work. I'll take Group 2. Crix muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. Slowly, the others began to fall in line, each taking their assigned roles. Lila could feel the weight of their doubt pressing down on her, but she refused to let it deter her. This was her chance to prove them wrong, to show them that humans were more than just survivors of a harsh world. As the meeting adjourned and the cadets left to prepare, Lila remained behind, staring at the holographic battlefield. Her plan was set, but doubts lingered in the back of her mind. The simulation would be a test not just of her strategy but of her ability to lead a team that didn't believe in her. "Let them laugh," she muttered to herself. "They won't be laughing for long." The stage was set, the pieces in place. Tomorrow, she would lead her team into the simulation, and the galaxy would see what a Deathworlder was truly capable of. The air was thick with tension as the cadets filed into the command center the following morning, their expressions ranging from guarded curiosity to outright skepticism. Lila Carter, standing at the center of the holographic display, projected an air of quiet determination. Today was the day she would execute her plan. And though the weight of doubt from her peers pressed heavily on her, she focused on the task at hand. Her strategy was bold, even dangerous, but it was her only chance to prove she was worthy of the leadership position she had been given. As the countdown to the simulation began, Lila reviewed the fleet's status one final time. The cadet fleet consisted of a motley assortment of ships, each designed and operated by the Academy's diverse species. There were the bulky, heavily armored cruisers of the Thalzar, built for endurance, the sleek, fast-moving interceptors of the Xraya, perfect for hit-and-run tactics, and the agile, crystalline vessels of the Rillians, whose energy-based technology provided a unique edge in long-range engagements. However, the simulation's parameters had intentionally limited their resources, forcing them to rely on clever coordination rather than brute force. The enemy fleet, in contrast, was a model of ruthless efficiency. Its ships were uniform in design, each bristling with advanced weaponry and protected by impenetrable shields. It was the embodiment of a superior force, designed to push the cadets to their limits. Lila studied the enemy formation intently. Their ships were arranged in a tight phalanx, a strategy that maximized firepower while minimizing vulnerabilities. It was a tactic that had crushed many cadet teams in previous simulations. "Everyone to your stations," Lila ordered, her voice firm but calm. "You know your roles. Stick to the plan, and we'll get through this." Her team dispersed, each cadet heading to their assigned command pods, where they would oversee specific sections of the fleet. The holographic display flickered to life, projecting a real-time view of the simulated battlefield. Lila's heart raced as the countdown reached its final seconds. The simulation began with a deafening silence. In the vacuum of space, the cadet fleet moved cautiously into position, their ships gliding through the stars like silent predators. Lila had divided the fleet into 3 groups, each with a specific objective. Group 1, led by Crix, was tasked with launching the feint attack on the enemy's front lines. Group 2, under Nissa's command, was positioned near an asteroid belt, ready to strike the enemy's flank. Group 3, Lila's hidden reserve force, remained cloaked within the dense nebula, their sensors and communications dampened but their presence concealed. Group 1, begin your approach, Lila instructed, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Crix's gruff voice crackled through the comms. "About time. Let's see if this plan of yours has any teeth." Lila ignored the jab, focusing instead on the holographic display. Group 1's ships accelerated toward the enemy fleet, their movements calculated to appear as a full-scale assault. The enemy responded predictably, redirecting their forces to meet the apparent threat. Lila watched closely, her sharp eyes analyzing every shift in the enemy's formation. The phalanx was holding, but small gaps were beginning to appear as the enemy overcommitted to countering the feint. "Group 2, hold position," Lila said. "Wait for my signal." Nissa's calm, measured tone came through the comms. "Understood. Holding position." The first engagement unfolded like a meticulously choreographed dance. Crix's ships fired volleys of plasma beams, their bright streaks illuminating the void of space. The enemy retaliated with devastating precision, their advanced weaponry tearing through the cadet fleet's shields. Lila's heart clenched as she saw 2 of their ships go down, their holographic icons blinking out of existence. "Pull back, Group 1, Lila ordered. "Don't overcommit." Crix hesitated, his frustration evident. "We're not done yet." "Pull back," Lila repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "That's an order." With a growl of annoyance, Crix complied, his ships retreating just as the enemy fleet surged forward. Lila's gamble was working. The enemy had taken the bait, leaving their flank exposed. "Group 2, prepare to engage," Lila said, her voice tinged with urgency. "Target the gap in their formation." Nissa's ship sprang into action, darting out from the asteroid belt with a speed and precision that only the X-Raya could achieve. Their interceptors launched a coordinated barrage of missiles, striking the enemy's unprotected flank. The impact was immediate and devastating. The enemy fleet's formation wavered, their tightly knit phalanx unraveling under the unexpected assault. "Excellent work, Group 2, Lila said, her confidence growing. "Group 3, stand by for reinforcement." Despite the success of the initial strikes, the battle was far from over. The enemy fleet quickly regrouped, their advanced AI adapting to the cadets' tactics. Lila could see the enemy ships repositioning, their movements calculated to trap Group 2 in a deadly crossfire. "Nissa, fall back to the asteroid belt," Lila commanded. "Don't let them box you in." Nissa responded immediately, her ships weaving through the debris field with practiced ease. Lila's mind raced as she adjusted the battle plan on the fly, her fingers dancing across the control panel to issue new orders. "Group 3, prepare for a flanking maneuver," Lila said. We'll hit them from the rear while they're focused on Group 2. Her reserve force began to move, their ships emerging from the nebula like phantoms. The enemy fleet, preoccupied with pursuing Group 2, failed to notice the new threat until it was too late. Group 3 launched a devastating assault, their concentrated firepower tearing through the enemy's rear lines. For a brief, exhilarating moment, it seemed as though victory was within reach. But the enemy AI, relentless and unyielding, adapted once more. Their ships shifted formation, cutting off Group 3's advance and forcing Lila's forces into a defensive posture. The tide of battle hung precariously in the balance. Lila's plan had dealt significant damage to the enemy fleet, but the Cadet's resources were dwindling. Every move she made was met with a counter, every advantage eroded by the enemy's relentless efficiency. Lila's gaze darted across the holographic display, her mind racing to find a solution. She refused to let doubt creep in. Even as the odds stacked against her, the battle was far from over, and she was determined to see it through. "Regroup and hold the line," Lila said, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. "We're not done yet." As the simulation continued, Lila's leadership was tested like never before. Every decision carried the weight of her team's survival, every moment a test of her resolve. She knew the eyes of the Academy were on her, judging her every move. But for Lila, this wasn't just a simulation, it was her chance to prove that humanity's strength lay not in brute force, but in ingenuity, resilience, and the unyielding will to defy the odds. The simulation's midpoint brought an eerie stillness to the battlefield. Ships from both fleets floated in tense anticipation, their weapon systems primed, shields humming with energy. In the command center, Lila Carter leaned forward over the holographic display, her mind churning with calculations. She knew the respite was temporary. The enemy AI was recalibrating, preparing for a counterattack that would test the limits of her strategy. Her team, scattered across the simulated fleet, awaited her next move. The comms were alive with murmurs of tension, punctuated by the occasional impatient remark from Crix, or the calculated observations of Nissa. They were holding, but barely. The Cadet fleet had sustained significant losses, and their remaining forces were operating at reduced capacity. If the enemy struck now, they might not survive another direct engagement. Lila exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus. The nebula that had concealed Group 3 was no longer a viable hiding spot, it was compromised. The asteroid belt offered some cover, but it limited maneuverability. The battlefield itself was a puzzle, a chessboard where every move could be their last. "Status report," she ordered, her voice cutting through the chatter. Nissa responded first. "Group 2 is holding position near the asteroid belt. Shields at 65%, ammunition reserves at 40%. We can manage another skirmish, but not a prolonged engagement." Crix's voice followed, gruff and edged with frustration. "Group 1's down to half strength. We've lost 2 more cruisers. If this was a real battle, we'd be vapor by now." Lila didn't flinch at the grim assessments. The odds were grim, but they weren't insurmountable. "Understood." "Group 3? Aurelian Cadet, their voice a crystalline hum, spoke for Group 3. "Still operational, but our energy reserves are critically low. If we're not reinforced soon, we'll be unable to maintain effective combat." The situation was dire, but Lila saw an opportunity amidst the chaos. The enemy fleet, while formidable, had shown a predictable pattern. Their reliance on overwhelming force left them vulnerable to precision strikes. If she could exploit their overconfidence one final time, she might be able to turn the tide. She straightened, her voice steady as she addressed her team. "We're going to shift to a defensive trap. Group 1, I want you to fall back toward the debris field. Use it for cover and bait them into overextending. Group 2, keep their flank pressured. Harass them, but don't overcommit. Group 3, move to the far side of the nebula and prepare for a coordinated strike." There was a moment of silence, and then Crix broke it with a growl. "We've already lost too much. If this fails. It won't, Lila interjected, her tone leaving no room for argument. This is our best shot. Stick to the plan. The holographic display shifted as the fleet moved into position. Group 1's cruisers limped toward the debris field, their shields flickering but holding steady. Group 2's interceptors darted around the asteroid belt, their hit-and-run tactics forcing the enemy to divide their attention. Meanwhile, Group 3 vanished into the nebula, their stealth systems activated as they prepared for the decisive strike. The enemy fleet responded as Lila had anticipated, pursuing Group 1 with relentless aggression. Their larger ships barreled through the debris field, their sheer size making them impervious to the smaller fragments of wreckage. But their focus on Group 1 left their rear lines exposed, a critical weakness that Lila intended to exploit. Nissa. Now, Lila commanded. Group 2 launched a flurry of missiles from the asteroid belt, their trajectories weaving through the battlefield with pinpoint accuracy. The sudden assault caught the enemy off guard, forcing them to redirect their forces to counter the threat. It was the opening Lila had been waiting for. Group 3. Engage, she ordered. The ships of Group 3 emerged from the nebula like specters, their weapons blazing as they targeted the enemy's vulnerable rear. The attack was devastating. One by one, the enemy's ships succumbed to the onslaught, their shields collapsing under the concentrated firepower. For a fleeting moment, victory seemed within reach. The Cadet fleet's coordinated assault had turned the tide of battle, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. But then, the enemy AI adapted once more. The remaining ships regrouped with ruthless efficiency, their movements precise and calculated. They closed ranks, forming a protective barrier around their flagship, a massive dreadnought bristling with weapons. The dreadnought was the linchpin of the enemy fleet, its destruction the key to ending the simulation. Lila knew they had to take it out, but it was heavily fortified, its shields impervious to conventional attacks. Suggestions? She asked, her voice taut with urgency. Nissa spoke first. We could concentrate all our firepower on the dreadnought, but it would leave the rest of the fleet exposed. If the enemy counterattacks, we won't survive. Crix chimed in, his tone reluctant but resigned. A suicide run might work. Ram a ship into their shields and create an opening for the rest of us. Lila shook her head. We're not sacrificing anyone. There has to be another way. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. The dreadnought's shields were designed to repel direct attacks, but what if they could bypass them altogether? She studied the holographic display, her gaze narrowing on the dreadnought's engines. A plan began to form. Listen carefully, she said. Group 1 will draw their fire, keeping their attention on the front lines. Group 2, I need you to disable their secondary escorts, focus on speed and precision. Group 3, we're going for the engines. If we can disable them, the dreadnought will be dead in the water. Her teammates hesitated, the audacity of the plan sinking in. But there was no time for doubt. The enemy was already repositioning, preparing to strike back. Move now, Lila commanded. The Cadet fleet sprang into action. Group 1 launched a desperate assault on the dreadnought, their cruisers exchanging fire with its formidable weapons. Group 2 darted between the enemy's secondary ships, their precision strikes crippling key systems. Meanwhile, Group 3 circled around the battlefield, their ships navigating through the chaos to reach the dreadnought's rear. The final phase of the battle was chaos. Explosions lit up the void, debris scattering across the battlefield as ships clashed in a desperate struggle. Lila's commands were rapid and precise, her voice cutting through the cacophony as she coordinated the fleet's movements. Group 3, target the engines, she ordered. Focus all firepower on their propulsion systems. The ships of Group 3 unleashed a barrage of concentrated energy blasts, their weapons striking the dreadnought's engines with surgical precision. Sparks erupted as the shields flickered, and then, with a deafening roar, the engines failed. The dreadnought lurched, its massive frame drifting helplessly as it lost power. We did it, Nissa exclaimed, her voice filled with disbelief. But Lila wasn't celebrating yet. The Dreadnought's weapons were still operational, and the enemy AI was far from defeated. She knew they had to end it now. Group 1, regroup and target the bridge, Lila said. Let's finish this. The combined firepower of the Cadet fleet converged on the Dreadnought's bridge, their weapons tearing through the remaining defenses. The final explosion was a brilliant burst of light, signaling the end of the battle. As the holographic display faded and the simulation ended, the command center fell silent. Lila's team stared at her, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and awe. For the first time, there was no mockery, no doubt, only respect. Lila took a deep breath, her heart pounding with relief and triumph. She had done it. Against all odds, she had led her team to victory. The simulation might have been over, but for Lila, it was just the beginning. She had proven herself, not only as a leader but as a representative of humanity's potential. And she knew, deep down, that this was only the first of many battles she would face. As the holographic battlefield flickered out of existence, the silence in the command center was deafening. Lila Carter stood at the center of the room, her shoulders tense, her breath coming in slow, measured pulls. Around her, her team alien cadets who had doubted her leadership, scoffed at her strategy, and mocked her species sat frozen in their seats. The simulation had ended, but its echoes lingered in the charged atmosphere. They had won. Against impossible odds, they had defeated a superior enemy fleet, and they owed their victory to the human cadet they had so quickly dismissed. The final explosion of the Dreadnought had been as satisfying as it was symbolic, a moment of catharsis that shattered not only the simulated enemy fleet, but also the prejudices that had plagued Lila since the day she arrived at the Lactic Academy for Strategic Defense. Yet even as the weight of the victory began to settle over her, Lila felt no urge to celebrate. There was no triumph in survival, only lessons to be learned. The room remained eerily still as the instructors entered. Admiral Theron, his towering Thalzar frame casting a long shadow, strode to the center of the command deck. His silver-scaled face betrayed no emotion as his piercing eyes swept over the assembled cadets. Behind him, several other instructors, each representing a different species, followed with equally inscrutable expressions. Lila's heart raced. This was the moment she had been dreading as much as anticipating the evaluation. Admiral Theron gestured for Lila to step forward. She obeyed, her boots echoing softly against the polished floor as she moved to the front of the room. Standing before the council of instructors, she felt small, vulnerable, but also resolute. She had given everything to this simulation, and she was prepared to defend every decision she had made. Cadet Carter, Theron began, his voice deep and deliberate. Your performance in this simulation was unexpected. The words hung in the air, their ambiguity unsettling. Lila held her ground, refusing to flinch under his scrutiny. She knew better than to expect praise. The Galactic Academy valued results, not ego. Theron continued, you were faced with overwhelming odds. A weaker leader would have folded under the pressure, and yet you managed to achieve victory. Explain your reasoning behind your strategy. Lila took a steadying breath before speaking. The enemy's strength lay in their numbers and firepower. A direct engagement would have been suicide, so I focused on exploiting their overconfidence and predictability. By forcing them to overcommit and exposing their vulnerabilities, we were able to dismantle their fleet piece by piece. Theron nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Your use of the nebula and asteroid belt as tactical assets was unorthodox. It placed your forces at significant risk. Yes, sir, Lila admitted. But it also gave us the element of surprise. I believe the risk was justified to achieve the objective. And your decision to target the Dreadnought's engines rather than its weapons systems? It was the fastest way to neutralize their mobility and isolate their flagship. Once their engines were down, they became a sitting target. Theron exchanged a glance with the other instructors, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, he turned back to Lila. Your strategy was sound, Cadet. Bold, but sound. The faintest hint of approval in his tone sent a wave of relief through Lila. But before she could savor the moment, another instructor stepped forward, a crystalline Rillian whose voice carried the resonance of a finely tuned instrument. Cadet Carter, the Rillian said, your leadership was instrumental in this victory. However, it is worth noting that your team suffered significant losses. How do you reconcile this? Lila hesitated. The losses weighed heavily on her, even though they were simulated. Every loss is a failure on some level, she admitted, her voice quieter now. But in a scenario like this, where the odds are so heavily stacked against us, some sacrifices are inevitable. My goal was to minimize those losses while achieving the mission objective. I regret that I couldn't save everyone, but I stand by the decisions I made. The Rillian nodded, satisfied with her response, and stepped back. Theron resumed his place at the forefront, addressing the entire room now. Victory in this simulation required not only tactical ingenuity, but also the ability to inspire a team that did not believe in you. Cadet Carter demonstrated both. However, he added, his gaze sweeping over the other cadets, it is worth noting that many of you initially refused to follow her leadership. This lack of cohesion is a flaw that must be addressed if you are to succeed as officers in real combat. The words struck the room like a hammer, and Lila could see the shame flicker across her teammates' faces. Crix, who had been one of her harshest critics, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usually defiant expression subdued. Nissa, whose support had been grudging at first, now looked contemplative, her feline features softening with unspoken respect. Theron's tone grew sharper. Leadership is not about species or physical strength. It is about strategy, adaptability, and the ability to make difficult decisions. Cadet Carter has shown these qualities in abundance. Let her performance serve as a lesson to all of you. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken apologies and realizations. Lila felt the weight of the moment, the shift in perception that she had fought so hard to achieve. She had not only proven herself as a leader but also challenged the prejudices that had defined her place in the academy. As the instructors dismissed the cadets, the room began to empty, the tension dissolving into quiet murmurs. Lila stayed behind, gazing at the now dormant holographic display. The simulated battlefield had vanished, but the lessons it had taught her remained vivid in her mind. Carter. She turned to see Crix approaching, his massive frame towering over her. For a moment she braced herself for another sarcastic remark, but his expression was different now, softer, almost hesitant. You did good, he said gruffly, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. I didn't think you had it in you. Guess I was wrong. Lila blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected admission. Thank you, she said simply, unsure how else to respond. Crix nodded once, then turned and left without another word. A moment later, Nissa approached, her sleek movements as fluid as ever. You earned this, Nissa said, her tone warmer than before. And for what it's worth, I'm glad I was wrong about you. Lila smiled faintly. Thanks, Nissa. As the command center emptied, Lila found herself alone, the weight of the day settling over her. She had faced impossible odds, defied expectations, and emerged victorious. But more than that, she had begun to change the way her peers saw her and, perhaps, how they saw humanity as a whole. Walking out of the room, she felt a sense of quiet pride. The journey ahead would not be easy, but she was ready for it. She had proven herself, and now she was ready to face whatever challenges the galaxy had in store. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Lila Carter felt like she truly belonged.